All right. Welcome, everyone. Super excited about this topic. We're going to be jumping into this erythritol conversation, just squashing it, talking about the entire study, what it actually looked at, what the data actually says, and just clearing the air once and for all. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Dr. Ryan Lowery, Dr. Jacob Wilson. Excited to be here with each and every one of you. So you ready to jump in?
Ready to jump in. Let's do it.
All right, so let's start with what the actual study looked at. And I think we can break it down into 4 parts, right? The first part, if you look at what they did, they looked at thousands of diseased and metabolically dysregulated people. That's very important to remember, both in the US and in Europe, over a 3-year period of time. And they looked at circulating levels of erythritol in the blood, and they found that they were correlated with major adverse cardiovascular events. They call these MACE, M-A-C-E. That's number 1, and we'll jump into that. Number 2, they took platelet-enriched plasma, super concentrated plasma, platelets, up to 5 times the normal amount.
5 times the amount.
And found erythritol increased aggregation, which is an early step in blood clotting. So that's the second part of what they did, right? First part was they did this correlational analysis. Second part, they looked at these platelets in this human plasma. Third part is they injured the arteries in mice, and they literally injected it with erythritol. And they found that it sped up clot formation. And then lastly, the fourth thing they did was they gave 8 humans 30 grams of an erythritol bolus and found that it spiked levels over 1,000x compared to baseline, and this stayed elevated for up to 2 days. So we need to address each one of these areas. And before we do that, I think something that's important is we're not going to beat down the authors of this study. That the study was actually well conducted.
Well conducted.
A very, very well, to be published in Nature, it has to be well conducted. I think the problem that we're having is how these headlines are interpreting it, and people are taking it out of control to believe that the erythritol sweetened drink that they're drinking is now going to have some adverse effect on them. And by the end of this video, whether you're watching it live or later on, you will understand that that is not necessarily the case. So let's jump into it. Let's start with part 1, the epidemiological data, where they looked at these thousands of individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. So great breakdown, Ryan, really great breakdown. Like Ryan says, to get published in Nature, it's a big deal. I think we got to step back to the beginning of the first thing and understand the real purpose of the study was to find metabolites that are indicators of major cardiovascular disease, right? You know, dying of cardiovascular disease, all these major adverse events related to cardiovascular disease. That's beneficial, right? If I go on the blood and I find like, hey, having super high elevated levels of blood glucose is linked with heart attack, that's good. It's good that I know that, right? But it doesn't, these things aren't necessarily causative is the biggest thing. It's an indicator. Oh, right. This is elevated in the blood. We probably got to do something, okay? So let's break down each element of this. The first thing, Ryan and I have been doing research together for a lot of years now. Over a couple of decades now, we've been doing research together. And the first thing that you learn when you're in science, I remember one of my mentors, Dr. Sawyer, the first thing he told me was like, hey, Wilson, you need to understand you cannot generalize beyond your population. So we weren't allowed to do that in class. So understand that when you read headlines, they're generalizing, hey, healthy people can't take erythritol. Erythritol in healthy people might make you die. Okay. This population were diseased. They just were diseased. Almost 25% of them were type 2 diabetic, right? Coronary artery disease, it was something like 73% of them. 73% of them had coronary artery disease. 18% of them had heart failure.
These people were sick.
Yeah.
Metabolically sick.
They're metabolically sick, and all of them were overweight. And borderline, the average was obese. So these were obese, diabetic, people with coronary artery disease, and heart failure. So and it was an older population. They were elderly. So that's our population. We don't want to, and you never generalize beyond your population. Just realize that's the population. Okay? So the first thing we need to understand is this. When you see something elevated, is it causal? And what the next thing we learn in science is that correlation does not equal causation. And there's a concept that you talked about, we were talking about earlier today, that Dr. Ryan talked about was reverse causality. So what does reverse causality mean? Because you see something, it doesn't mean it's the cause. It could be a symptom that was caused by something else, right? So let's look at this condition. Let's look at erythritol. When we think erythritol, we think, oh, this is a sugar alcohol that's a non-nutritive sweetener or a very, very, very low-calorie sweetener that if you take it, it raises up in the blood. Well, this must mean that these elderly diseased people are taking a lot of erythritol, right? Is that what it means?
No. And they looked at this, right? So they did not look at, did people actually consume erythritol?
No, they didn't look at it at all.
This data that they're looking at came from the early 2000s when erythritol wasn't even a popular sweetener. So these people, there's a very, very low chance that any of these people, these thousands of people that they were looking at, consumed any erythritol in any of their foods or beverages at all.
Exactly. So that's the first point. These people weren't even likely consuming erythritol via a low-calorie sweetener, packet, additive, whatever. Okay, so then, well, how's it raise up in the blood? Well, it turns out, everybody, that there's a pathway called the pentose monophosphate pathway, that basically in our bodies can produce erythritol. And it's very interesting that so what's the point of this pathway, right? Well, basically, it can shunt glucose into other metabolites, right? For example, it can convert you can convert glucose, you can produce NADPH, and other metabolites. Now, what's important to understand is that the pentose monophosphate pathway, besides producing energy, also is used to buffer what we call oxidative stress. So when we're in conditions of high inflammation and disease, guess what's elevated, everybody? Oxidative stress. So if you're stressing, when we see obesity, cardiovascular disease, oftentimes the pentose monophosphate pathway is elevated. So, and interestingly enough, there was a recent study that you and I talked about earlier today with obese people. And basically, well, not obese people, excuse me. Actually, these were healthy people.
These were healthy people.
These were healthy freshmen. And basically, they took freshmen. You know what happens the first year of freshmen? I used to be a professor. Freshmen come in, young, skinny. After the first year, they might gain 15 pounds, right? And so people have studied this. And what they found is that freshmen coming in, the ones who actually gain the most weight, and these people aren't thinking about, I'm taking low-calorie sweeteners, guys. Yeah. The people at the highest level of erythritol actually had the most weight gain. So you go, oh my God, is it because they're taking erythritol? No. Those people actually had the highest baseline values of A1C, which is a marker of fasting glucose levels. So basically, these people had the highest levels of fasting glucose, and the study showed that glucose converts to erythritol. So, talk about it, Ryan. What is the number one thing with people with diabetes? What do they have?
Yeah, they have dysregulated metabolism. They have insulin resistance. They have a ton of oxidative stress. These people are metabolically sick, and that's what we're seeing with people. These freshmen came in, they had hyperinsulinemia, which we know drives oxidative stress, which we know is probably the reason why they also had high levels of erythritol in the blood. And so I think the take home here is that erythritol is kind of this covariate of all these other things that are going on. It's not that these people were consuming erythritol. It's that they had elevated levels of erythritol because they were metabolically sick, had high levels of insulin, high levels of glucose, high levels of oxidative stress.
So, and again, guys, breaking that down to that reverse causality, one, high levels of glucose get converted over to erythritol. They showed that in the freshman study, and they even showed that mechanistically. Two, high levels of oxidative stress and inflammation increase the pathway which produces erythritol. Three, they didn't even measure erythritol intake, okay? But people who have disease states and their doctor is saying lower your sugar intake, what are they going to do? They'll oftentimes take low-calorie sweeteners. So even if they were taking erythritol, it wasn't necessarily the cause of this because your doctor is saying you're going to die and you better eliminate sugar. So what are you going to do? That's reverse causality, guys. So again, what can we conclude from this first study? We can conclude that elevated levels of erythritol okay, which is an indicator of high oxidative stress, elevated activity of the pentose monophosphate pathway, because it's back in the 2000s, is an indicator that you're going to have a major cardiovascular problem. And it's also more of an indicator of you have metabolic dysregulation. Now, one thing I know, Ryan, you've looked at a lot of problems with metabolic dysregulation. Are there other metabolites that you've seen for people like this that are elevated?
Yeah, so here's an example that many of you will recognize, right? In uncontrolled diabetes, you see a large elevation in ketone bodies, right? You have a large rise in ketones. With the same thinking, you could say, oh my gosh, ketones are super dangerous, right? Just because in this metabolically dysregulated state of uncontrolled diabetes, it's a very, very rare state, but it happens where these people go into ketoacidosis, which we know can be dangerous. But that could lead people to go, oh, these ketone things are the things that are causing the danger. And we know that's just not true. We know from the benefits of a ketogenic diet. We know that from the benefits of exogenous ketones. We also see this with people who have metabolic dysfunction. You know what else is elevated in their blood? BCAAs, branched chain amino acids. We know these are the building blocks that we need for building muscle. Right? They're elevated in people who are metabolically dysfunctional. So we can take that same school of thought and go, oh, BCAAs are dangerous. We know that BCAAs have a ton of benefits. We know that these things are beneficial when consumed and can help improve overall health and longevity.
Exactly. So we know diets that are higher in branched chain amino acids make people leaner, less body fat, more mitochondria, greater satiety, all this stuff. So we're going to walk away. So here we go. If you were to look at those metabolites, you go, oh my God, ketones are high, BCAAs are high. Don't eat protein. Don't eat dietine protein, or don't eat animal protein, which we know what that leads to. Don't take BCAAs, false. And then don't take ketones. Yet we know ketones help with a variety of disease states. Ketones help with a variety of conditions, and ketogenic dieting leads to longevity, weight loss, all sorts of things. And this is just the beginning of metabolites that are elevated. So again, what we can take out of this is if you're not consuming a lot of erythritol or whatever, and you see elevated blood levels of erythritol, you probably have metabolic dysregulation. And that's a problem. You need to change your lifestyle.
100%. So I think that clears the air on that first part, right? Where they looked at all these thousands of people, correlational analysis in metabolically dysregulated people. Let's go to the second part, right? So they take these human cells and they look in the cell culture model. Tell us a little bit about what they did and what they found.
Yeah, so what they did was they used platelet-enriched plasma. Now, I've heard a lot of people go like, they go, oh, it's a cell culture model, and people will go, oh, no, but it's from healthy subjects. Guys, there's a reason why it's called platelet-enriched plasma. Platelet-enriched plasma has up to 5 times the amount of platelets you would normally find in plasma. So again, let's go back to you can't generalize beyond your population. A cell, a human. A cell, a human. Totally different populations. And now, or a cell culture model, humans. They're different populations, right? And secondly, you have platelet-enriched plasma. So you take a large amount of platelets, and then you basically bathe it in erythritol and say, oh my God, platelet aggregation goes up. I'm going to have a heart attack. You can't do that. It's not. It's completely different. Platelet-enriched plasma acts differently than what's going on in the normal body. It's just you can't compare the two. They're different populations. Once again,
you can't. And one of the things that we know, you want to know something else that increases platelet aggregation. Right? So we're taking this and we see, oh, erythritol increases platelet aggregation. You know what else increases platelet aggregation? Exercise.
Yeah.
So under the same school of thought, we could say, oh, exercise is dangerous.
It's dangerous.
We can't say that. We know that that's not true. And so we're looking at these little mechanisms, like these cell culture studies. In isolation, you can't extrapolate beyond that.
You can't.
And so that's another example. There have been several studies that have looked at exercise and shown that it increases platelet aggregation. Over the long haul, we know there's a plethora of benefits with exercise for cardiovascular disease.
Well, once again, going back to that, you go back in like the 40s and 30s and 50s and stuff, exercise increases the heart size. So they go, well, people of hypertension have a hypertrophied heart. They have a larger heart. So therefore, exercise is bad for you, right? Again, guys, the way that it makes the heart hypertrophy is totally different than actually it does in a hypertension model. So once again, you can't look at something and go bad. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
So again, can't generalize your population. A cell culture model using platelet-enriched plasma cannot be generalized to the normal population. It just can't.
So we addressed the first two, right? The epidemiological data, the cell culture data. Now, we've talked about this with colleagues, posted about it on LinkedIn. They're like, but they did an in vivo model. They did this mouse model, and they also saw some increased platelet aggregation or these increased markers of clotting. This is a problem. Well, again, we need to look at what they actually looked at. So let's talk a little bit about this in vivo model. This is a third thing that they did where they looked at these mice and they basically injected erythritol, and they saw increased levels of clotting. Let's talk about this model and why it's not an accurate representation and why mouse models in general aren't great models for cardiovascular disease.
Well, one, most people know mouse models are poor models of cardiovascular disease. So listen, I've done animal research, Ryan's done animal research, and that's just, it's not an ideal model in general for cardiovascular disease. So one, again, don't generalize beyond your population. But the second thing is, we need to make, how does this apply to our real life, okay? So, is there a situation where someone's gonna go, injure your artery, and then inject you with erythritol? Your
carotid.
Yeah, your carotid artery. So I'm gonna injure your carotid artery, and then right when that happens, boom, I'm gonna inject you with erythritol. It's just, it's not, once again, and I'm not against animal models. What I'm saying is that the animal model is not reflective of what you're seeing in like the newspapers and generalizing that to human beings. It's just not. Number one, when we consume erythritol, it's different than injecting it. Anytime I consume something, it goes through my digestive tract, it's different than injecting something. That's number one. Number two, I'm going to injure the artery, and then I'm going to inject with erythritol. I'm going to say that applies to the real population. It doesn't. So once again, it's difficult to take the mouse model and say, oh, that's applicable to normal human beings, stop taking erythritol. And that's why I think we have to go back and say, guys, wait a second here. I know you're talking about this, but why is it even allowed to be used as a supplement?
Right.
And obviously, Ryan, you've done a lot of work in this space. So talk about like what's going on. How does a supplement even get on the show? What are the governing bodies for these things?
Yeah, there's a lot before we jump into the safety of it, because I think that's the final piece, is it really comes down to the toxicology and safety studies on it. But they did something else, and everyone's talking about this fourth part that they did with the humans. And so they took 8 individuals, they took 8 humans, they gave them a bolus of 30 grams of erythritol, and they looked at how much erythritol is in their plasma over 7 days, but they saw that it was elevated for 2 days. And the spike within 30 minutes of taking 30 grams of erythritol was 1,000x baseline. Okay. And so they're trying to, now it's like painting this narrative of like high levels of erythritol in the blood are associated with these factors. Look at what happens when you consume this erythritol. Look at what happens. Talk a little bit about the data between like, how much do people actually typically consume with erythritol? Right. And is 30 grams an accurate representation of what someone consumes at one time?
Right. Well, first of all, look at something like a low-calorie vitamin drink or something like that. Most of the vitamin drinks, whether the generic or the main brand, it might be 4 grams of erythritol. So you're talking about consuming a lot. You're downing a lot of those vitamin low-calorie drinks.
At one time.
At one time. To do that, right? So it's not realistic. What that represents is more like, first off, it represents like the 90th percentile on a 24-hour period, like over your entire day. So once again, a bolus of 30 grams is not really realistic. And also think about it, nothing's slowing it down. You know what I mean? Like it's gonna be rare that you're gonna drink 30 grams of erythritol. Yeah. And things are different even, like a lot of times maybe if you eat an entire pint of keto ice cream, but even then, that's not fluid. Yeah. It's different. The digestive dynamics are different in that environment.
That's a great point. And it's also, I'm sure many of you have had erythritol at some point, whether it's in products, as a sweetener instead of making things at home. By nature, it's self-limiting, meaning like erythritol does have a cooling effect. So once you get over the 5 grams, maybe 10 grams, you kind of feel like you're having some mouthwash.
You do.
Because you get the cooling sensation in the back of your throat. So 30 grams is very unrealistic, for most people. And the other thing I want to point out before we jump into the safety of erythritol, because that's ultimately what matters in humans, is what these headlines and a lot of these people who are interpreting this data forgot to mention is people aren't going out and just consuming erythritol for fun. They're using it as a replacement for sugar. Yep. And I think that was missed, and it was not talked about enough, in that it's not like they're taking in 4 grams of erythritol on top of 250 grams of carbohydrates or sugar a day. These people are replacing the sugar with erythritol as a sweetener. So it would negate a lot of the hyperinsulinemia and those blood glucose effects that you would get from having such a high sugar, high carbohydrate load.
Yeah, and here's the thing to understand, like when you drink like sodas or soft drinks in general, your body actually doesn't become that much more satiated. And some studies show you don't become more satiated at all. And some studies show you become hungrier, because you get a spike in glucose and a drop. And of course, we know there's a lot that these things like soft drinks are causing metabolic dysregulation. So say you take a guy who's obese and they're drinking 5-6 sodas a day, and that's not unheard of. And when are they drinking them? With their meals. So like they might wake up in the morning, okay, and have a coffee that's sweetened with 30, 40, 50 grams of sugar. Then at lunch, they have a burger with the bun and a big gulp with sugar. And then at dinner, they have their biggest meal and they're having another, big gulp. And at the end of dinner, they're having ice cream with sugar. Now, you're going to tell me that the purpose of erythritol is to eliminate those things. So you're telling me the guy who's obese now wakes in the morning, has a coffee, puts 4 grams of erythritol in there, because that's what normally happens, not going to have 30. I can absolutely guarantee you that they have to pour a lot of erythritol in that coffee for that to happen. Then at lunch, maybe they'll have a beverage, again, that's probably going to have 40 grams of erythritol. Now they're up to 8. And then at dinner, maybe they do the same thing and maybe they have some ice cream. So maybe they're at 12 grams on the day. Say they went to 16. They just replaced 150 grams of sugar. Now you tell me what is going to have more of a benefit for cardiovascular disease. The sugars basically we know is going to lead to the cardiovascular disease. Replacing that erythritol is probably going to cause weight loss, right? Oh, yeah. Lower blood lipids, lower triglycerides. It's going to counter cardiovascular disease. So going back to what Dr. Ryan said, what's the purpose of erythritol, right? And I think that's the point.
100%. So that's a good overview of the study, kind of breaking down each of the areas. Now let's jump into the safety of erythritol, and then we'll wrap it up with some take-home messages to just finally squash this thing so it's done and out of headlines. The USDA has something called GRAS, which means generally recognized as safe. EFSA, which is the European version, the European Federation, they also have a GRAS status. Both of them have given erythritol GRAS status, meaning it's generally recognized safe. In order for something to be GRAS, it needs to go through a lot of examination for both safety in animals and human models. Yep. Let's start with some of the safety studies and what they found with human equivalents of 70 plus grams?
Well, the human equivalent studies have given 70 plus grams a day. When we talk about animal models, they've given it over the lifetime, almost the majority of the life of the animals. So now what they're doing is imagine you're taking 70 grams of erythritol for the majority of your life, when you're a kid through old age. And basically what they found is they don't find anything, no toxicity. What they do is they literally take out the organs. So they'll take out the organs of these animals, look at the heart, look at the kidneys, look at the liver, and go, no difference between taking erythritol 70 grams a day and not equivalent. Then they look at tumors. They don't see an increase in tumors. They look at mortality. They don't see anything. So that this is generally the gold standard on toxicity studies, because it's hard to do that on a human. This is a 3-year study. You're mimicking an entire lifespan in this one. So that's again the gold standard on toxicity studies show there it's safe, not where you're taking a rat, injuring their artery and injecting them on the spot with erythritol. This is looking at the whole lifespan. And of course, the other interesting thing is that when we look at the mechanisms, like from a safety perspective, and now we're going to look at actual more physiological representations of animal models, we actually see that it may improve things like what's called endothelial function. Mm-hmm. So endothelial function, we think, when I was back in grad school, is when endothelial function started to become really popular. And one of my old professors, Dr. Arturo Figueroa, dedicated his life to endothelial function. What happens is you have your blood vessels. They're lined with what's called endothelium. And the endothelium release things that allow the blood vessels to relax, to improve blood flow. And there's a lot of other things within the endothelium that happen. So imagine that like your blood vessels can't respond and increase blood flow to a meal. You're going to be insulin resistant, mm-hmm. right? You'll have higher blood pressure. So there are blood vessels to be responsive. Well, it turns out that oxidative stress hurts the endothelium. And so basically, we know, intriguingly enough, erythritol seems to have antioxidant properties.
In both animals and humans.
Yeah.
So they've done studies in animals. They did actually in diabetic rats.
Yeah.
And found that it had antioxidant effects and improved endothelial function.
Yeah.
And then there was a study in 2014, Flint et al. They took people who were at high risk of cardiovascular disease, gave them 36 grams of erythritol per day. I think in that study they split it up into 12.
They did.
12.
Yeah.
They split it up into 3 servings of 12, which is a little bit more of a normal. It's better than giving it all.
Because no one's going to consume 36 grams. It's just not. I mean, can you imagine how cold that would be?
It's brutal.
Yeah.
Brutal. And still, in that study, for 4 weeks, they gave 36 grams per day. And they found that it improved endothelial function, decreased blood pressure, and had all these positive benefits that would be associated with cardiovascular disease in a human model.
Yep. So again, that's a high dose. What do we see? In real living humans, we see the opposite happen. Central blood pressure decrease, endothelial function improve, right? And actually, this is a population that's more similar to what the study showed. So that's why some people postulate, is this a protective mechanism? Is your body trying to counter the negative effects that you've inflicted on it in this unhealthy lifestyle? And very well may be the case.
And we've also done some safety studies with exogenous ketones. And in the study that we were doing, the exogenous ketones were flavored with erythritol.
Yeah.
And these are both published. We published one in adults and actually in adolescents, which was really interesting. Talk a little bit about the results of that study, because we did give erythritol that study at a pretty good dose.
At a realistic, we simulated the original scenario I talked about with the obese gentleman. Basically, what we ended up doing is we gave 3 servings a day, which is more realistic to your top line erythritol user.
Yep.
3 servings a day of erythritol probably. And we actually found, this was 90 days, a 90-day safety trial. We looked at everything. We looked at cardiovascular health, blood pressure, no change, no negative impact. We looked at a bunch of psychological parameters, no negative impact on psychology. We looked at liver function, kidney function, no negative changes. Blood glucose, regulators of blood glucose and insulin sensitivity, no negative changes. And we did this in adults, and we did it in adolescents. 2 studies, we found nothing, no negative impact. So again, you can't generalize beyond your population of that original study.
Exactly. So the safety seems to be pretty clear.
Yeah.
And the studies are out there to show that. Let's wrap this up for everyone, put a nice little bow on it for our main take-home messages. Let's talk about the association study, platelet study, mouse study, and take-home. So that way, all of you can share this with your friends, your family members when they shoot this to you. When next time you're making a recipe and you put erythritol and they freak out about it, you can share this with them. So let's give some take-home messages. What's the take-home message on the association study, the first part of this study that's making headlines?
Yep, the first study was an association study where they basically found that people who are diseased, have heart failure, have type 2 diabetes, coronary artery disease, and are borderline obese, that they seem to have higher levels of erythritol. Once again, We talk about reverse causality. We know that when you have high oxidative stress, the pentose monophosphate pathway is elevated and that you're producing more erythritol. This is likely the cause of higher, in other words, the disease is causing elevations in erythritol is the most likely explanation rather than erythritol causing disease, especially because back when the study was done, people weren't consuming erythritol.
Exactly.
So that's the first part.
Second study, the platelet study. So they took these cells, they bathed them in erythritol, and they found increase in platelet aggregation.
Yeah. So second study is they took, again, can't generalize beyond the population. You can't generalize behind cell culture and whole body healthy individuals. They took platelet-enriched plasma. Platelet-enriched plasma has an extraordinarily large amount of platelets that you wouldn't normally find. That's why it's platelet-enriched. They take the cell culture, they bathe in erythritol, platelet aggregation, which is a early indication of clotting, goes up. But once again, you can't take super high levels of platelets, then bathe them in erythritol and generalize that to the general population. It doesn't work.
Third part, they took these mice, they hurt their carotid artery, they injected it with erythritol, and then looked at clotting factors. What are some of the problems with that?
Well, the problems is, when are you going to crush your artery or injure your artery and then inject you? Hey, I got an idea. I just, had a stroke or whatever, or injured my artery. Hey, I got an idea. Let me inject myself with erythritol. Probably not going to happen. Once again, we consume erythritol from the diet. It's just not realistic.
And lastly, let's wrap this up with the established safety on erythritol. What's out there? What does the safety say?
Yeah, well, the established safety is outstanding on erythritol. Absolutely outstanding. Toxicity studies showing taking 70 grams a day for the majority of an animal's life shows no increase in tumors, no change in any organ function, no change in organ weights, no increase in tumors, no increase in mortality, no increase in cardiovascular, none of that stuff in toxicity studies. Then we move to human trials. In fact, when you take people who are at risk for cardiovascular disease, like type 2 diabetics, you give them 36 grams a day of erythritol, which is not realistic, for 4 weeks straight. It improves endothelial function, which is the number one probably cause of cardiovascular disease mechanistically, and lower central blood pressure. Finally, we did a trial where we gave 3 servings a day of ketones, each of which were sweetened with erythritol. No negative impact on blood pressure or any other measure of cardiovascular function, no impact on liver function, no impact on kidney function, no impact on psychological parameters of health. And this was both in healthy individual adults as well as adolescents.
Incredible. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that helps clear up a little bit of this erythritol nonsense. And again, it was a well done study.
Yes.
It's the headlines and these other people who are taking it out of context, interpreting it completely incorrectly. It has nothing to do with erythritol, normal erythritol consumption. So by all means, continue consuming erythritol. And so what are some of the other sweeteners? We like allulose, monk fruit, stevia.
Those are my favorites, yeah.
And erythritol.
And erythritol, those are my favorite sweeteners.
All right, guys, let us know in the comments any other headlines, anything else that you want us to help clarify. We are here to help clear the air and educate. Appreciate you all. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.